As the plane slowly climbed, the passengers relaxed into their books, movies, and phones. This flight from New York to San Francisco didn't bode well, and most of the passengers were already deep in their own affairs, enjoying the tranquility of the flight. In the middle of economy class was Jason Carter, an African-American man in his late 40s who looked like an ordinary passenger, dressed modestly in a t-shirt and jeans. He sat at the window, enjoying the view of the clouds, and tried to ignore the curious glances of some of the passengers. Jason is a heart surgeon with many years of experience and incredible dedication, but neither his professional success nor personal achievements were written on his face. To everyone, he was just another passenger in economy class. As the flight attendants began serving drinks, Jason noticed that one of the passengers sitting across the aisle was giving him a disapproving look. The man, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a silver briefcase, seemed to have casually dropped a disparaging remark in Jason's direction. Jason was used to such attacks and chose to ignore him, even though he felt a little annoyed inwardly. Always noticing such small biases is a part of life that he has already learned to deal with. He reminded himself that the main thing was to stay calm and not waste his nerves on those who judged by their appearance. Soon, the flight attendant came over with the drinks. She also gave Jason a slightly suspicious look, as if wondering if she could offer him a free drink. But Jason politely thanked her and ordered a bottle of water, leaving the situation unnoticed. Everything went smoothly until the restless sounds began in the cabin. Suddenly, a startled exclamation rang out several rows ahead, and the passengers around them turned their heads, trying to understand what had happened. An elderly man sitting 3 rows in front of Jason suddenly clutched his chest and started gasping for air. Passengers began to worry, and someone jumped up from their seat, trying to call the stewardess. At this moment, one of the flight attendants ran up to the man, and then loudly asked in the cabin, "Is there a doctor among the passengers?" There was an oppressive silence. No one responded. Jason, realizing the gravity of the situation, resolutely got up from his seat and walked towards the man. Several of the passengers looked at him again, and the man in the expensive suit just grinned, muttering something like, "We've found a lifeguard." But Jason ignored him. He knew that the man's life was in danger, and he was ready to act. If help is not provided immediately, the consequences may be irreversible. Taking a deep breath and maintaining his composure, Jason walked over to the man and looked at the flight attendant, who was still trying to gauge if he could help. "I'm a doctor," he said confidently, waiting for an answer. At this moment, the passengers froze, and everyone who witnessed this scene began to look more closely. Will Jason still be a hero? Find out how he will act and how this unexpected test of his professionalism and human resilience will end. Jason Carter is a man who has been used to facing difficulties and overcoming them since childhood. Born and raised in a poor neighborhood in Brooklyn, he realized from an early age that the future must be built by himself. From an early age, Jason watched as his mother, a strong and independent woman, worked 2 jobs to ensure that he and his younger sister had a normal life. "They didn't have any special privileges, but my mother always emphasized, 'You can become anything if you really want to.'" It was her words that became the first incentive for Jason to strive for more. From an early age, Jason was interested in science and medicine. Although he had to overcome many stereotypes and preconceived expectations on the part of others, his perseverance and talent showed up early. Already at school, he showed himself as one of the best students, especially in subjects related to biology and chemistry. Teachers and mentors noticed his skills and aspirations and supported him in every possible way, telling him how to get into prestigious medical schools. Jason knew that to become a doctor, he would have to work twice as hard as many of his peers, but the thought that one day he would be able to save lives gave him strength. Jason went to one of the best medical universities in the country. It was hard and exhausting, but he was ready for it. Realizing that this was his only chance to reach a new level, Jason devoted himself to his studies, often sacrificing sleep and rest. During his studies, he had often come across hints that he was lucky to get into university, but Jason knew that his success was the result of hard work, not a happy accident. He believed that his knowledge and professionalism were more important than all stereotypes. After years of hard work and continuous improvement, Jason became a doctor, a true professional who put the interests of his patients first. He chose to specialize in cardiac surgery, one of the most complex and demanding areas of medicine, where every operation could be a lifesaver for the patient. His path wasn't easy. Jason often faced biased attitudes from both colleagues and patients, who doubted his competence just because of his background and appearance. But his determination and willingness to fight for the life of every patient kept him going, despite all the difficulties. Over the years, Jason has become a highly qualified specialist. He was respected by his colleagues, and many patients trusted him with their lives. Despite his success, he remained a modest man who did not like to flaunt his achievements. He saw his work as a way to make the world a better place by helping people in difficult moments of their lives. This approach to work has made him one of the best in his field. On the operating table, Jason was adamant and confident. He knew every detail and subtlety of his work, because every patient saved was proof to him that his efforts were not in vain. But despite his professional success, Jason was still a person who was able to sympathize and empathize. He didn't see patients as just cases or diagnoses. For him, they were people with their own fears and hopes, who trusted him with their lives. It was this quality that set him apart from other doctors. Patients felt his care and genuine concern, and this in turn strengthened their trust in him. Jason understood that his duty was not only to heal, but also to support morally, helping to cope with difficulties. However, not everything in his career went smoothly. Even after becoming a recognized specialist, he often faced the fact that his abilities and professionalism were called into question. There were still traces of bias in the corporate culture of the hospital where he worked, and he knew that some patients and colleagues judged him not by his skills, but by his appearance and background. Jason has learned to take such moments with restraint, realizing that this is part of the reality with which he has to live. Each of his days began with the realization that he had to be on top, that his decisions and actions could save or destroy someone's life. He knew that he was dealing with the most difficult cases, and his reputation and the well-being of his patients depended on it. Despite his inner turmoil, he always remained calm and focused in critical situations. Even when others doubted his competence, Jason maintained faith in himself and his skills, because he was following this path for a goal that was above any preconceived opinions for him. Friends and colleagues noted his inner peace and reliability. Jason was a good listener and was always ready to support those who needed advice or help. He was a man of action rather than words, who preferred to solve problems rather than discuss them. In the operating room, he showed incredible confidence and concentration, but outside of it, he remained a simple, calm person who did not put himself above others. He wasn't interested in awards and honors. The most important thing for him was the fact that he could help others, making the world a little better. When Jason was on the plane, his modest clothing and quiet demeanor caused others to misjudge him. He was used to the fact that people tend to draw conclusions based on first impressions, so he didn't react to sideways glances and barely audible comments. He knew who he was and what he was capable of. His experience and professionalism were his real calling card, not his appearance and the way he dressed. Although he was willing to ignore the situation, his professional instincts did not allow him to remain indifferent when someone nearby needed help. His calmness, confidence, and desire to remain inconspicuous were all part of his character, which was formed over the years. Jason did not seek public recognition and preferred to be known by his deeds rather than by his title. But one day, when the plane was in a critical situation, his skills and experience became something that could change not only someone's life, but also the views of everyone who was close to him. The plane was rocking slowly at altitude when Jason noticed a commotion a few rows in front of him. A man in his 70s sitting by the window started looking around nervously, then clutched his chest and panted. His face turned pale, his breathing became ragged, and he began to lose consciousness. The tension in the cabin was growing by the second, as the passengers around them noticed this, started whispering in alarm and attracting the attention of the crew. Sitting a few rows back, Jason immediately realized the gravity of the situation. He professionally evaluated the symptoms and realized that the man was having a heart attack. This was the kind of case where minutes counted, and procrastination could cost the patient his life. But instead of rushing straight to the man, Jason paused for a moment, watching the reactions of those around him. He knew that his intervention might cause doubt or even hostility, especially considering the attitude he had faced since boarding the flight. Flight attendants quickly approached the man and tried to help him, but their skills were limited. They could only offer basic first aid, not understanding what they were dealing with. Soon, one of the flight attendants looked up and asked in a loud but reserved voice, "Is there a doctor among the passengers?" The question hung in the air, and there was a ringing silence in response. The passengers glanced nervously at each other, but no one responded. Jason, hearing the question, quickly realized that he would have to act. He collected his thoughts, remembering all the necessary actions to save the patient, and resolutely got up from his seat to go to the flight attendant. However, as he started to move forward, the passenger next to him gave him a dismissive look and muttered something like, "I wish I'd stayed where I was." Jason didn't pay any attention to it. He wasn't in the mood for personal insults right now. Every moment mattered. As he strode along, some of the passengers looked at him disapprovingly, as if they didn't believe he could be a doctor. One of the men, dressed in a business suit and carrying a laptop, remarked ironically, "Does someone from economy class suddenly turn out to be a medic?" Jason, who was used to such comments, continued walking, although a sense of frustration was growing inside him. How many times had he had to face the fact that his professionalism was called into question just because of his appearance and background? However, he didn't let those words lead him astray. As he approached the stewardess, Jason spoke confidently, "I'm a doctor. I can help you." She looked at him a little doubtfully, as if testing whether this man in a simple t-shirt and jeans could really handle such a situation. Her eyes were clearly disbelieving, and she didn't even immediately give him access to the patient. Jason realized that despite the urgency, he would have to prove his competence once again. "Sir," the flight attendant said, trying to look professional, "we have instructions, and we need to make sure that you are suitable for medical care." Jason replied in a calm and confident tone, trying to be as brief as possible, "I'm a heart surgeon. Please allow me access to a first aid kit and medical instruments." The flight attendant froze for a moment, realizing the gravity of the situation. She glanced at the dying man and then, reluctantly, stepped aside to let Jason join the patient. Without wasting a second, Jason began his search. The man, by all indications, really suffered from a heart attack. His hands were clutching his chest, and his eyes were half closed in pain. Jason quickly made a diagnosis and demanded access to a first aid kit, which he knew should contain drugs for such cases. However, the flight attendant, still not entirely sure that Jason was really a doctor, hesitated, as if trying one last time to assess whether to trust him. "Please, this is an emergency," Jason said calmly but firmly, seeing her confusion. It worked. The flight attendant hurried to bring a first aid kit, and Jason went into action, fully focused on saving the man's life. A small group of passengers gathered around, watching the scene with concern and interest, some of them whispering in disbelief that this particular person was the one who would save the passenger. Jason remained composed. He knew that the patient's life depended on him, and he did not allow himself to be distracted by others. He applied an oxygen mask and quickly administered the necessary medication, knowing that he only had a few minutes to stabilize the man's condition. As he worked, he caught a few surprised glances as the passengers watched his precise and confident actions and gradually changed their attitude. Jason was treated with respect, and some even quietly thanked him, realizing that he was not just a passerby, but a highly qualified doctor. After Jason performed all the necessary manipulations, the man's condition stabilized. The patient began to breathe more evenly, his face took on a healthier hue, and he opened his eyes, looking gratefully at Jason. Silence fell around them as passengers and crew members who had previously looked at Jason in disbelief now realized who he really was, and that his calm competence had saved the man. Now that the emergency treatment was done, Jason took a step back, allowing the flight attendants to take care of the man. One of the passengers sitting next to the patient said softly, "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would be able to react so quickly." Jason just nodded, trying not to draw too much attention to himself. But there was a sense of satisfaction inside him. He had done his duty, even in the face of initial distrust. The flight attendants, who had initially been skeptical of him, now showed their respect. One of them came up to him and apologetically thanked him for his help. "I'm sorry that I doubted. We all jump to conclusions sometimes." Jason, understanding her words, just smiled and answered, "It's important that the person is safe now." The passengers who had previously looked at Jason with disdain now couldn't hide their surprise. Each of them witnessed not only saving a life, but also how a person can turn over preconceived expectations, while maintaining calm and professionalism. After Jason stabilized the elderly passenger, the silence in the cabin was once again replaced by traffic and whispers. The flight attendants returned to their usual duties, and the passengers gradually recovered from the shock, discussing the incident. Most of their eyes were on Jason, who was calm and composed, but he was the center of attention for them. Their tacit respect was palpable, and even those who had previously cast unfriendly glances at him now looked at him differently. Jason himself was surprisingly calm, but his emotions were raging inside. He knew that he had not just saved a person today, but had unwittingly exposed the hidden bias of many around him. Those who had previously treated him with disdain were forced to change their minds after seeing his professionalism. However, to him, this respect seemed empty. He understood that this recognition was not the result of a conscious respect for him as a person, but a reaction to his action. Perhaps if he had stayed in his chair and not intervened, no one would have known he was a doctor. But now that everyone was aware of his qualifications, they looked at him differently, even though he knew it was a superficial change. When the plane rocked slightly due to turbulence, several passengers looked around in alarm, but quickly went back to their business. Jason moved away from the patient, giving the flight attendants instructions on how to continue caring for him. He wanted to go back to his seat and focus on the thoughts that were churning inside him, but before he could, the pilot was at his side. He was a tall, slightly gray-haired man, whose professionalism and experience were evident in all his gestures. His expression was serious and full of gratitude. "Dr. Carter," the pilot began, shaking Jason's hand firmly. "On behalf of the crew and all the passengers, I want to express my gratitude to you for what you did. You helped a person at a critical time, and we all appreciate it. We understand that without your help, things might have turned out differently." Jason nodded his thanks, accepting the words without emotion. It was a familiar etiquette, familiar to every doctor who faced dangerous situations. He knew that his action really saved a person's life, but instead of pride, he felt a slight bitterness. The pilot suggested that Jason switch to business class for the rest of the flight so that he could rest. It was a sign of respect and gratitude from the team, but Jason only stiffly declined. "Thank you, but I'm comfortable in my seat," he replied with a polite smile. He didn't want to change his location to emphasize his status, he preferred to stay where he was. It wasn't a gesture that required recognition, it was doing its duty. When the pilot returned to his duties, Jason headed back to his seat. But his path was blocked by one of the passengers, the same man who had previously cast disparaging glances and sarcastic comments in his direction. Now he looked confused, as if he didn't know how to talk to Jason after all that had happened. The man hesitated, and finally, choosing his words, said, "Dr. Carter, I'm sorry. I guess I was wrong. Thank you for what you did." "I'm sorry about what?" "What I said at the beginning." His voice was shaky and his eyes were averted. He clearly felt uncomfortable, not knowing how to compensate for his behavior. Jason responded to his awkward apology with a controlled look that was both understanding and calm. He didn't hold a grudge, but he knew that the man's apology wasn't due to any realization of his own mistakes, but rather to a reaction to his actions. For Jason, it was important that such biased judgments disappear initially, and not just after proving his competence. "Don't worry," Jason said softly, "we all jump to conclusions sometimes. But this is the moment when you can reconsider your judgments." The man bowed his head slightly, looking thoughtful, and for the first time, a hint of genuine understanding appeared on his face. Perhaps today's situation really made him rethink his views. He took a few steps back to let Jason walk back to his seat, but occasionally shot him grateful glances, clearly impressed. Jason returned to his seat, but his attention was still drawn to the glances of the passengers around him. There was a slight murmur around him again. People were whispering to each other, discussing how easily he had handled the situation and how confident he had been. Some of the passengers who had previously looked at him with prejudice were now throwing respectful glances in his direction. They tried not to attract his attention, but they couldn't hide their astonishment. Jason was approached by one of the flight attendants, the one who had initially doubted his professionalism. She looked confused, but she was genuinely smiling. Her voice was softer now, and her expression was apologetic. "Dr. Carter," she began, fidgeting awkwardly with the corner of her uniform, "thank you for your help. Sorry for the fact that at the beginning, I didn't trust you right away. Sometimes we all make mistakes. I didn't expect a professional like you to be here." Jason gave her a soft smile, knowing that her apology was sincere. He was used to the fact that first impressions are often misleading, and he didn't blame her for the judgments she made earlier. Jason nodded his thanks to the flight attendant, noting that her apology was sincere. Although her attitude had been biased at first, She now looked at him differently, as if realizing that hasty judgments often turn out to be false. He knew that her sincere apology was another small but significant step towards changing people's attitudes and perceptions. But inwardly, Jason felt that this incident was just a reminder of how deeply rooted stereotypes are in society. When the flight attendant returned to her duties, Jason closed his eyes, trying to regain his inner balance and get some rest. But even in the silence, he was surrounded by whispers and admiring glances from the passengers. One elderly woman sitting a few rows ahead turned to him and nodded gratefully, as if that gesture was the only way to show her respect. Other passengers were whispering, looking at each other and discussing how unexpectedly this person from economy class had appeared to them. Soon, one of the flight attendants approached him again. She thanked him on behalf of the entire crew and relayed the message that they had already notified the airport medical service so that the patient would receive proper care immediately upon arrival. It was a sign that his work as a doctor was complete, at least at this stage. Jason thanked her and reflected, remembering how many times in his life he had faced similar situations, when trust and respect came only after a demonstration of his professionalism. As the plane began to prepare for landing, Jason looked out the window, thinking about today's incident. Inwardly, he felt satisfied that he had done his best, but there was also a slight bitterness. Yes, he had managed to change the attitude of others towards him, but he understood that he was respected now not because of who he was, but because he was the right person at the right time. He knew that such incidents rarely changed one's core beliefs, but he hoped that at least some of the passengers would learn an important lesson from the situation. When the plane landed, Jason stayed in his seat, allowing the other passengers to get out first. The older man he'd saved walked past, holding the flight attendant's hand, and gave Jason a grateful look, who gave him a brief but warm nod. There were no big words or admissions in this simple exchange of glances, but Jason knew that he had done everything he could. On the way out, some of the passengers came up to him to express their gratitude, and he accepted it with the same calmness and restraint with which he had performed his act. As he walked out of the terminal, he felt that another episode in his life had shown that prejudice can be overcome not by words, but by actions. But inside, he still had a question: why is it so hard for people to see the true value in others before something like this happens? After landing, Jason expected that his story would remain unknown and be forgotten as quickly as the flight had passed. He was counting on it all to remain just a random incident, one of many he'd been through in his career. However, as he was preparing to leave the airport and go to the arrival hall, an airport representative approached him with a request to stay for a few minutes. At first, Jason thought it was due to medical formalities or the need to provide details of what had happened for a report. But instead, he was asked to go to a separate room, where a man in a business suit and with a businesslike expression was waiting for him. He introduced himself as the airport manager and expressed gratitude for the professionalism and timely assistance provided to the passenger on board. "We are aware of what you did, Dr. Carter," he said, shaking Jason's hand, "and on behalf of the airport, we would like to thank you for what you did. It's not every day that we see such dedication and professionalism. If it wasn't for you, the situation might have turned out differently." The attention was unexpected for Jason. He was used to the fact that his work usually remains unnoticed, and did not expect that after the flight, his act would arouse such interest. Moreover, the airport manager informed him that several passengers had left thank you notes for Jason, telling him how calmly and confidently he had handled the crisis on board. Among these reviews were those who were initially skeptical of him, but now recognized that Jason literally changed their perception. The manager suggested that Jason have a coffee in the waiting room and discuss what had happened in a more relaxed setting. Jason accepted the offer, even though it all seemed a little unnecessary. He felt that people were putting too much emphasis on what he normally did, but he was grateful for the respect that his profession and personality now received. The manager sat down at a table and continued the conversation, asking how Jason decided to become a doctor, what brought him to medicine, and why he chose such a complex specialty as cardiac surgery. Jason spoke cautiously about his journey, explaining that he always sought to help people, despite the difficult circumstances and obstacles that he faced. The manager listened intently, nodding occasionally and jotting down a few notes, which surprised Jason all the more. But the surprise of the meeting wasn't just the manager's interest in Jason. A few minutes later, they were joined by another man who turned out to be a journalist for a local news channel. Jason was taken aback by the reporter's appearance. He expected that his act would go unnoticed by the general public, but it turned out that his actions had already aroused interest not only among passengers and airport staff, but also among the press. The man, who introduced himself as a reporter for a local news channel, greeted Jason with visible enthusiasm and, without even sitting down, immediately began to talk about how his story touched people. "Dr. Carter, your dedication is exactly what people need to hear," the reporter said, clutching a notepad. "You probably don't know, but several passengers from your flight have already left their reviews on social networks, telling about how you saved a life right in the air. Your story has already started to spread online, and I think it's important to tell it to as many people as possible." Jason stared at the reporter, trying to hide his slight confusion. He hadn't expected the incident on board to attract so much attention, much less become news. On the one hand, he was pleased to see that people appreciated his efforts, but on the other hand, he always took his work as a duty and did not seek recognition. "Thank you for your assessment, but I just did what I thought was right," Jason replied calmly. "I'm a doctor, and my job is to save lives, no matter what the circumstances." However, the journalist, clearly seeing him as a modest hero, was not ready to give up the opportunity to tell his story so easily. He suggested that Jason give a short interview to share not only the details of the incident on board, but also his vision of the role of a doctor in society. For the journalist, this case was an important opportunity to show how a person can overcome stereotypes and serve as an example for others. At first, Jason hesitated. He has always preferred to keep a low profile, focusing on his profession rather than the public spotlight. But his story did contain an important message about how difficult it can be to overcome bias and prove your competence. He recalled the looks of the passengers and their reactions before and after the rescue. This case was another confirmation of how important it is to fight against established stereotypes, and Jason realized that perhaps this story can really change someone's attitude and views. "Good," he nodded after a moment's thought. "I agree to answer your questions if it helps people realize that you should not judge a person based on their first impression." The reporter nodded happily, clearly pleased with Jason's agreement. The reporter set up the recorder and asked Jason the first questions. At first, the conversation concerned events on board, how he noticed that the elderly passenger became ill, what measures he took to save his life, and what helped him stay calm at a critical moment. Jason's response was brief and unemotional, explaining that it was a common display of professionalism for him. But the journalist sought to deepen the interview, trying to bring Jason's story to a level that will touch readers and make them think. "Dr. Carter," the reporter said with interest, "you said that you did what any doctor does, but I think that many people are not used to the fact that professionals of your level fly in economy class. What can you say to those who judge people by their appearance or social status?" Jason paused for a moment, considering the question. This moment concerned not only today's incident, but also his entire life, filled with the struggle against stereotypes and bias. "You know," he began calmly, "I've come across different opinions, stereotypes, and distrust in my career. But I realized one thing: what matters is not how others see you, but what you do. Human value is determined by their actions, not by the place they sit or the clothes they wear. Today's case proved it once again. You don't need to judge a person by appearance or class." The journalist recorded his words with a serious expression on his face. He understood that Jason wasn't just talking about his actions, he was communicating his vision of how important it is to get rid of bias. For Jason, this interview was an opportunity to convey to people that true respect and trust do not need formalities and do not depend on status. The interview only lasted a few minutes, but when it was over, Jason felt a little relieved. He knew that this story was no longer just a story about the doctor who helped on the plane, but a message about fighting stereotypes and how there was always something more behind the appearance. When Jason finished his interview with the reporter and left the terminal, he felt an unexpected mixture of satisfaction and a little tired. He usually avoided public attention, preferring to stay behind the scenes, but today's situation showed him that sometimes such attention can be useful, especially if there are ideas behind it that are important not only for himself. As he stepped out into the main concourse of the airport, Jason was ready to slip away into the city's usual rhythm, but he noticed that several passengers on his flight seemed to be waiting for him. With gratitude and smiles filled with respect, they began to approach him one and two at a time, expressing their appreciation and shaking his hand. These people, The same ones who had looked at him with suspicion and disdain so recently now found the strength to admit how much his action had changed their attitude. The faces that had been filled with disbelief were now beaming with genuine appreciation, and Jason felt a special warmth in that. The first person to arrive was a man in his 40s, who had been sitting nearby on the plane and probably doubted Jason the most at the start of the flight. Now he looked at it in a completely different way, with the realization of how wrong his initial conclusions were. "Dr. Carter, I want to thank you again for what you did," he began, looking away a little sheepishly. "I am truly ashamed of the thoughts I have allowed myself to have about you. Your action showed how easy it is to make a mistake in evaluating a person." Jason smiled softly. He was not judgmental, and he knew that this man, like so many others, was a hostage to the stereotypes that were ingrained in his mind. He wasn't interested in judging, and he didn't hold a grudge. Instead, he wanted this person to leave with the knowledge that hasty judgments can be devastating. "Don't worry about it," Jason replied. "The important thing is that now you know how easy it is to make a mistake when judging a person just by their appearance. We all make these mistakes sometimes, but the main thing is to learn from them." The man nodded, and judging by the thoughtful expression on his face, the moment left a mark on his mind. Perhaps he was leaving the airport as a different person, and Jason saw this as a small but significant success. As the crowd around him began to slowly disperse, a representative of the airline approached Jason, a young woman in a formal business suit who carried herself professionally, but her eyes were full of respect. She introduced herself and thanked Jason on behalf of the company, expressing appreciation for his courage and dedication on board. "Dr. Carter," she began, with a slight tilt of her head, "we at the company are deeply grateful for what you've done. We understand that the situation might have been different without your help. As a thank you, we would like to offer you compensation for your ticket and premium service on one of your future flights." Jason thought about it for a moment, but he knew deep down that material rewards didn't mean anything to him. For him, the true value was the lives he saved and the trust of patients. He thanked her, but suggested otherwise. "Thank you for your suggestion, but I would be happy if you could transfer these funds to charity," he said, looking at her with a soft smile. "Let it be a support for young professionals who want to get an education and will one day be able to help others." The woman was clearly moved by his request and nodded, promising to pass on this wish to the management. For Jason, this moment was important. He knew that every little support can be a step towards a big change. With satisfaction, he realized that he had not just done his duty, but done something that would help others get a chance in life. After the airline representative left, promising to comply with his request, Jason was left alone again. His heart was warm. He understood that today was not just a working day for him, but a truly significant event. After leaving the arrival hall, he paused for a moment to collect his thoughts. This morning, he was just an ordinary economy class passenger, sitting among people full of biased views and quick judgments. But by the end of that day, he felt that he had made a small contribution to breaking down those stereotypes, even if it only affected a few people. On the way out of the airport, Jason thought back to the hours that had passed, remembering how many people had looked at him at the beginning of the flight, and how their attitudes had changed after he'd proved himself as a doctor. In this contrast, there was a simple but important truth. Often a person is forced to prove their competence and value only because of other people's preconceived ideas. Jason did not consider himself an exception. He was well aware that bias and stereotypes are deeply rooted in society. But he also believed that small examples could influence people's worldviews and encourage them to reevaluate their beliefs. When he left the airport building, he was stopped by an elderly couple, whom he helped to get off the plane. They thanked him for his concern, but this time their gratitude wasn't just a recognition of his professionalism. Their eyes were filled with gratitude that they saw in him not only a doctor, but also a man who had destroyed their own ideas of what a real professional looks like. "You didn't just save a life on board, Dr. Carter," the woman said, squeezing his hand. "You gave us the opportunity to see how important it is to trust and respect everyone, regardless of their position or appearance." These words sunk into his soul. He knew that he might not be able to change the entire world, but if he could change even a few people's minds, it would already be a significant achievement. After all, sometimes small changes lead to big results, and even the most ingrained stereotypes can be destroyed if people are ready for it. When Jason finally got out on the street, his mind was full of thoughts about how often people have to overcome stereotypes, prove their worth and professionalism in the eyes of others. He felt that something more than just helping a passenger had happened today. His story, which had spread on social media and had become an example for others, now took on a life of its own. He knew that what he was doing might be an inspiration to others and serve as a reminder of the importance of humanity and empathy. This day became for him something that he will remember not only as another challenge in his professional practice, but also as a personal achievement. Jason believed that such moments help people reevaluate their views and begin to change the world around us, step by step. It's been a month since Jason Carter found himself in the spotlight after an incident on board a plane. After the interview at the airport and thanks from passengers, he thought that the story would gradually die down and become just another chapter in his life, like the doctor's calls that he was used to over the years of practice. But this story continued to live its own life. Passengers' notes about the incident and interviews with Jason were distributed on social networks, and his story gained unexpected popularity and continued to attract attention. Gradually, it went beyond the borders of one city, and it began to be talked about on a national scale. A week after returning home, Jason received a letter from a major medical university where he had once studied. His alma mater invited him to give a speech to graduates of the new stream, which will soon go to hospitals and clinics around the world. Jason was touched by the invitation. He recalled his own years in medical school, when he was still a student, full of doubts, but with a firm belief in his destiny. He knew how important it is for young professionals to see examples that inspire and remind them that the path of a doctor is not just a career, but service to people. When Jason arrived at the university, he was greeted as an honored guest. His story, which happened on board the plane, became known to teachers and students, and many were happy to meet a man who seemed to embody all the best qualities of a professional: humility, dedication, and the ability to break stereotypes without requiring recognition. When Jason took the stage in front of the graduates, he felt that this meeting was not just a lecture, but an opportunity to convey to the young audience his vision of what it means to be a doctor. He began his speech by telling me how he had started his career in medicine, how he had encountered biased attitudes, but despite this, he had always believed that the most important thing was actions, not the opinions of others. He reminded the graduates that true professionalism is not only skills and knowledge, but also the ability to be a person who can show empathy and support others in a difficult moment. Jason talked about how important it is to stay true to yourself, despite the pressure of society, and that every doctor is someone who not only treats, but also inspires. Jason continued his speech to the graduates, talking about the challenges he had to go through on the way to his dream. He shared with them stories that were not part of the curriculum and that neither lectures nor textbooks would prepare them for. He knew that many of them had yet to face the bias or skepticism that comes along the professional path, especially when you don't meet the expectations of others. For Jason, each of these moments was not just a challenge, but a test that helped him become stronger and, more importantly, gain self-confidence. "We are all taught that medical excellence is measured by skills and knowledge," Jason said, looking around at the audience, "but experience has taught me that true professionalism is more than that. This is the ability to see a person, their pain and fears, and not just the diagnosis. Medicine is not only about working on the body, but also supporting the soul, especially when the patient feels vulnerable and lonely." The young graduates listened with bated breath. For many of them, Jason's words opened up new aspects of the profession that you can't always read in textbooks. His story on board the plane became for them not just an example of professionalism, but also a reminder of how important it is to preserve your humanity. Jason shared that throughout his years of practice, he has always sought not only to save lives, but also to build trust, which is the basis of a real medical relationship. When Jason finished his speech, the audience erupted in applause. He hadn't expected such a reaction, and this heartfelt admission touched him to the core. He knew that not all the listeners would immediately improve or change their views, but if his words could influence at least one of them, it was already an achievement for him. Professors and students came up to him after the speech, thanked him for his story and shared their experiences. Many of them were inspired by his experience. When Jason left the university, he felt a sense of lightness and inner satisfaction. He knew that his story about the flight was now more than just an accident. It has become a lesson for those who are ready to see a real person behind stereotypes, and a sincere humanity behind a professional role. This day reminded him that change is always possible if we are willing to learn and overcome ourselves.